ahead of us. So there are a few slides with an accompanying presentation that we will have about some of the research that the consultant team has provided. We are spending a little bit of time to further explain the health and race equity impact assessment, what it is, how to use it as a tool, and how we intend to use it for the We Will process. And then tying that to the overall theme of historical reckoning, which is one of the themes of the plan. We're going to have a short presentation about that and then spend a significant amount of time today in small groups to discuss and further define what historical reckoning means for us in this process. And then we wanted to leave plenty of time at the end for overall Q&A and discuss next steps. So in our last meeting, you heard report outs from pillar co-chairs, and we received tremendous feedback via the chat and verbally, a really rich discussion about initial reactions to the pillar definitions and guiding questions, which at that point were a work in progress. The pillar research teams have since met again and pretty much finalized the pillar definitions, the working definitions for themselves and for the plan and the guiding questions. We sent those out to everyone on Friday with this meeting's agenda, so you have them as a reference going forward. Last week was what we call a pillar week. It means all 7 pillars met and they spent their time using those guiding questions to begin to brainstorm objectives. I will say we used the feedback from advisory committee meeting number 2 in a few different ways. Some of the feedback we received were sort of big questions that we'll continue to grapple with in small and large groups, things that will inform the rest of the planning process and even the process of implementing and using the plan. If there was feedback specific to pillars, the team made sure to incorporate that in the conversations that happened as guiding questions were refined. And then some of the feedback we received are a little ahead of where we are in the process. They seemed more like policy recommendations. So we're sort of keeping them in the bike rack until we're ready to have those conversations. But over the last pillar week, there was a great conversation about turning the guiding questions into a laundry list of objectives that the pillar research teams will continue to refine over their next couple of meetings. And we've since posted all of the guiding questions by pillar on the wewillchicago.com website and are inviting everyone to respond to those and comment on those. So here's an example of what that looks like. In this case, it's the lifelong learning pillar. Folks can answer as few or as many as they'd like. We do have a social media toolkit if you'd like to help us spread the word, or you can share the posts coming out of DPD in the mayor's office. I see that Skylar also just posted in the chat a direct link to these. So we hope you will interact with them, share them with your networks. They're not meant to be like a referendum on the questions themselves, but more helping us understand if we had the answers to these questions, how would quality of life be improved? What's really the power of the plan objectives, recommendations that we can get in response to these guiding questions? Just a reminder how this all fits together. So there are the 7 pillars who have refined their guiding questions, and there's about 5 per pillar. I think there's a couple instances where they couldn't get it down past 6, but lots of passion and energy going into those. They have had their preliminary brainstorm about objectives, and they will continue to refine those objectives over meeting 6 and meeting 7. Ultimately, that will result in a policy framework. That's the rest of the work for this phase of the plan. So at the end of phase 2, then the policy framework would be ready to begin to think about the kind of broader engagement to get to how to design the implementation. So phase 3 doesn't mean we're already implementing the plan. It means we need to answer the questions of like how and who, the implementation methods of the plan that then would live on for years and be implemented then. We did spend some time as a consultant team and with the Pillar research teams looking at other cities, larger cities who have recently updated their citywide plan or comprehensive plan. We've looked at cities such as Boston, New York, Memphis, and even Edmonton. We had the idea, let's look to our neighbors to the north. And here's an example of what the Edmonton City Plan looks like and how these different components interact with each other or lead to each other. In the red text, you'll see the terminology we're using for We Will Chicago and how it corresponds to the Edmonton example. So we have 7 pillars. We've asked ourselves guiding questions that will lead to objectives and ultimately policy framework. In the Edmonton example, it's guiding values, led to outcomes, led to intentions and directions. But it was helpful to look to other cities to see what might we be missing? Does this make sense as a framework? And just generally to, see if we're on track with the state of the art in large city, citywide planning. So as I mentioned, phase 2 will conclude with this policy framework, and the pillars will continue their work on the objectives over their next 2 meetings. Outside of the pillars, wanted to give a brief update on what's happening in terms of larger community engagement. The artist organizer teams have been out. There are artist organizers by pillar and by geography. There's also a mobile team. So they're at the point where they're wrapping up their, summer and fall of robust calendar of events. And we're at the point where we're taking in all of the input received and starting to synthesize that. And the artist organizers will feature on an upcoming pillar research team agenda to make sure that, excuse me, the data is contextualized and we can have a conversation about what they've been hearing out talking to people and making sure that's connected to the work of the pillar research teams. I think what we'd like to do is share, there's some great links coming through in the chat, but as a follow-up email, we could also share these links so everyone has them as a handy resource. Some of them are more of a 4-year reference that you could dig through and look at, and others are more action-oriented, like the toolkit to connect people with the wewillchicago.com website. So the field notes from the artist organizers, their mobile team, kind of postcards, all of this coming in, being synthesized, being connected to the work of the pillar research teams, and then also connecting with people through the We Will Chicago website. That's what's been happening there. And then we have been gearing up for what we are calling community partner events. So as a reminder, on each pillar, there are community partners who are receiving stipends for their participation, not only in the pillars, but also for connecting the work to their constituents. So there are 25 community partners. They are all scoped to have 2 community events. So that means there are 50 upcoming events. And, we've kind of built in a structure to give them guidance, but also leaving it quite flexible. So the language that the meeting is conducted in, the group, how they're invited, who's invited, the geographies, whether or not it's pillar specific or more general, we've built in kind of a balance of flexibility and structure for that. The community partners also have opportunities to meet and learn from each other. That's part of the structure we've created. And then ultimately, we are gearing up, we hope with the second meeting of community partners, they'll elect to use Metropolitan Planning Council's meeting in a box, which they've been hard at work developing. That's a tool or an opportunity that's going to be widely available, but we thought it might be nice to connect that with the second meetings of the community partners. So we are aligning all of that. Really just continuing to expand the circle of engagement. And it's been fun to try these new ideas of compensated community partners, getting the details right, pivoting when necessary, but really under the idea of engaging as many people as possible in this process. I'm going to turn it over to Ranadeep to go through the baseline data that was shared with the Pillar research teams. We wanted to make sure and share it with you as well.
Thank you, Courtney. My name is Ranadeep Bose. I'm with SP Friedman. We are part of the research team we are part of the research team as part of the consulting team. So working hand in hand with Courtney and working on the Pillar teams here. So what I will be doing is presenting some historical context and current data that are actually really grim, but they represent real experiences of Black and Brown households in our city. I also wanted to acknowledge that the data are not just numbers and maps on our screen. That's how you see it, of course, but this data lives in our communities and have been playing out for generations, impacting so many of our family members, our friends, our neighbors. Our purpose for presenting this data, as Courtney mentioned, is to create a baseline of information on which to build the policy recommendations that are rooted in a commitment to anti-racism and undoing of past harms. If we go to the next slide, this is the redlining map of Chicago. We wanted all of the conversations to be grounded in historical reckoning by uncovering the root causes of past injustices. One major cause is the past practice of racist historical redlining that occurred in cities throughout the country in the 1930s and 1940s. So between this 1935 and 1940, the Homeowners Loan Corporation assigned grades to residential neighborhoods that reflected mortgage security. So you can see these categories that they have over there. There's, most of the south and west side and most of the city actually was definitely declining and hazardous. And of course, the south and west sides have that manifestation from this as it even today. But they basically used race and ethnic identity and class of residents to create these maps. And they this created rules and set a set of rules for nearly a century of real estate practices. And because of these racist perceptions of neighborhood decline in areas with a large percentage of Black and Brown residents, we had lenders flat out refusing to grant loans, or they were offering predatory loans with unfair interest rates and practices such as contract buying that caused many people to lose their homes. And so Tonika Johnson, a social justice artist, has a project called Inequity for Sale, where she mapped Greater Englewood homes sold on land sale contracts during the 50s and 60s, and how these contract sales directly contributed to the wealth gap and community disinvestment that we see today. There was a Duke University study that's referenced here in the sources, showed that Black families lost between 3 to 4 billion in wealth due to these discriminatory practices of contract sales. So these practices set off a cascade of disinvestment. While some areas of the city have reversed effects of redlining, much of the south and west sides continue to reckon with the fallout of this practice today. If you go to the next slide. So these practices set off one stark example of this historic fallout from redlining is our city's racial and ethnic and spatial composition, as shown in this dot map. This map is actually hot off the census, the 2020 census. You see these the segregation in plain sight here. Every dot here is basically 20 residents, And you, in most of these studies around the country, you'll see that Chicago is in the top 5 most segregated cities in the United States. And that's clearly shown by concentrated Black and Hispanic and Latino neighborhoods, and then separate, white neighborhoods. And so that's the segregation that's come out of the redlining practice. You go to the next slide here. And this, another indicator which it comes through is life expectancy. And this is a really, really stark differences. First is if you just look at, look at it by race, there is an 8.8-year gap, life expectancy gap between a Black and white family, a Black and white individual in Chicago. And if you also look at it by community area, there is almost a 20-year gap between areas with the highest life expectancy, like Forest Glen is at 83.2 years, and the community areas with the lowest life expectancy, like Fuller Park, is at 66 years. So that's a huge difference in there. And it's just this indicator is sort of cross-cutting. It covers physical, economic, social, and emotional well-being in this life expectancy factor. If you go to the next slide here, so this is where we see that racism and other past injustices manifest themselves in almost every aspect of people's lives. The map on the left shows the number of building permits per capita by community area over the past 5 years, an indicator of overall investment. The middle map displays an economic hardship index compiled by Chicago Health Atlas that incorporates unemployment rate, education level, income level, poverty rate, and many other factors. It's combined together. And the map to the right is a neighborhood safety index showing the results of a survey that asked residents how safe they felt in their own neighborhoods. And it's a very similar pattern. You see the south and west sides have lower levels of investment per capita, so lower levels of building permit value per capita. They have a higher neighborhood hardship index. So this is the economic factors and economic opportunities come through in here. And there's a feeling of being less safe. And so this is, again, all of these factors are affecting all of the aspects of people's lives. And then if you go to the next slide, this is, again, population change. This is the 2010 census and the 2020 census. And we are seeing that there's been a loss of Black and brown residents in long established communities on the south and west side. So of course, if you just look at the Black population, there's been nearly 85,000 people have left the city of Chicago. And clearly it's some of these quality of life factors which are probably contributing to this loss. There were gains in other races, but the key factor in here is if you look at the Hispanic population, even though there's an overall gain of 40,000, there's been a loss in some of these key neighborhoods like Logan Square in the northwest side, near northwest side of downtown. And that is sort of your area of key gentrification areas of the city. So, so you are actually seeing displacement in Pilsen, you're seeing displacement in Logan Square of minority households, which is the clear output of gentrification. And if you go to the next slide here. So this is in summary, we see that Chicago remains a very segregated city, and this is a direct outcome of the historic redlining and racism. There's been decades of disinvestment, which have produced major life expectancy gaps between majority white and majority Black and brown neighborhoods. There are Black residents leaving the south and west sides due to the quality of life concerns and the gentrification that you see in some of the neighborhoods where we're losing minority households. So I know that this data is reflective of a traumatic past and present. Our opportunity, though, through this we will plan is to create policies that will accelerate the transformation of Chicago to a more just, inclusive, and equitable city. And that is why we are doing this plan. And then I believe I will turn it over to Kate from CDPH.
Good morning. My name is Kate McMahon. I'm with the Chicago Department of Public Health, and I am part of the team that is supporting We Will Chicago through Health and Race Equity Impact Assessment. And I'm excited to preview for you what that work looks like and hopefully engage in some discussion about how the advisory committee can be connected to it. Could you go to the next slide, please? So again, I'm just going to do a brief, what is health and race equity impact assessment? I see folks who I know are very familiar with this type of work, and I imagine that there may be folks on the Zoom who are a little less familiar. So I just want to do a little bit of base setting first, and then we can talk about how we're going to integrate it specifically into We Will Chicago. And then I have some question prompts at the end to help improve our process, and then also our connection to the advisory committee. Next slide, please. And you can go one more. So when we talk about getting to equity, we've talked about it as both an outcome and a process. And we're going to focus now on equity as a process. And we know that that requires a new way of doing business. And health and race equity impact assessment can really support equity as a process in a couple of key ways. First, in certainly operationalizing our equity principles. So those sort of overarching guiding posts of the We Will Chicago. And they can do that by evaluating the benefits and burdens of policies and practices. And then also by engaging individuals and communities as experts in their own experiences to co-create the solutions and our evaluations for success. Next slide, please. And so really, just to demystify a bit, when we say health and race equity impact assessment or equity impact assessment, what we mean is a set of guiding questions and a community engaged process to assess the positive and negative impacts that could result from a proposed plan, policy, or project. We are talking about understanding the potential equity impacts. So who benefits and who is burdened by our decision making, and how are they engaged in decision making. And then really we're aiming to develop recommendations to make the plan, policy, project, et cetera, more racially equitable so that we are maximizing benefits and mitigating threats and burdens. So Chicago has been working on a way to combine the best of health impact assessment and also race equity impact assessment practice. And so you see at the bottom of your screen a few tools that have been produced and used in the field to do this. So our way of doing health and race equity impact assessment really draws on the work of Chicago United for Equity and their race equity impact assessment, some work around trauma-informed policymaking, and then also pretty standard health impact assessment. And so we've been working with a community accountability committee to really assess what are the most important elements of all of these practices, and how can we put it together in a way that can be applied to We Will Chicago, so that we are able to really embed this in the policy recommendations and decisions from the start. And I should say that health and race equity impact assessment works best when it is forward-looking, right? So this is a perfect time to be doing this within We Will Chicago, because it is going to help us embed equity in the policy recommendations from the start. Next slide. Great, thank you. And so just to, again, kind of go through, these are in draft form, but I wanted to show some of the guiding questions that we intend to ask as part of the policy recommendations in We Will Chicago. And so we have introduced this content to all of the pillar teams. We're going to be applying this content as part of the objective. So you saw Courtney reference that's coming up next. And then we're going to be doing this another time when we get to the policy recommendations themselves. So there's a couple of big categories. And again, these are the elements that our Community Accountability Committee felt are the most important. So the first is defining either the problem or opportunity. So what is the proposal and what problem or opportunity is it trying to solve or build on? A second big important area is acknowledging history. And this is going to come up again when we talk about historical reckoning. So how has systemic and structural racism shaped the events related to the problem that you're trying to solve? Another important element is shifting power. Who are the key groups impacted by this issue, and how will they be involved in the design, decision making, and also the development of accountability structure? Next slide, please. How are we looking at data? And when we say data, we mean numbers and narratives. So what disparities or strengths do the data reveal? What might be missing from the data? How are we assessing health equity? So what are the anticipated health benefits and harms? Who will bear them? And then again, measuring those benefits and burdens. So really getting at, who will benefit from this proposal and who will be burdened. And then one last slide of these. And then the last element that was most important to our working group was really this embracing accountability and committing to action. So asking ourselves, how will we be accountable to key groups most impacted by this issue? And how will we implement and evaluate and maintain changes over time? And then if you could go to the next slide, please. So I know I went through that quickly, but in the way that we're thinking about health and race equity impact assessment, we're, doing this throughout the We Will Chicago process. So again, we've done introductory content with all of the pillar teams. And then we've done some tailored examples depending on what their focus area is. We'll be now moving into, as they develop their objectives, really taking this framework and lens again. And then when we get to the policy recommendations, that's where these types of guiding questions are really the best used, right? So we'll be really digging in and asking those questions for policy recommendations. But I am interested in the chat, or if we have a little bit of time, if folks want to come on video too, just to hear how, from your perspective, we might strengthen our approach to really embedding equity into the policy recommendations now that you've seen our health and race equity impact assessment proposal, and then how might we connect and apply this to the work of the advisory committee too.
It's definitely a lot to take in, but very exciting as far as an unprecedented way to approach a citywide plan in the city of Chicago. So giving folks just a couple minutes, if there is a question you wanted to pop in the chat, you can.
I will also, sorry, Courtney, didn't mean to speak over you. I'm also going to put just an example from another jurisdiction in the chat as well. I know sometimes folks like to see, an example of what done might look like. So I'll put one in the chat too for anyone that's interested.
Great. And as Kate mentioned, this isn't the last time you'll hear about this. And that's true for the next topic, which is historical reckoning, which Skylar's going to lead the conversation. But we see the two as directly linked, and we see the two as important along the way. Neither one of these is a one and done situation.
I think we have a bit of time, right? Because I just want to lift up maybe the, if there's just pause for any questions. I know that was a lot of content, and this is a critical piece of the process. So I want to make sure that we're getting input from you all.
I just had a clarifying question in terms of, I was trying to take both of these questions in turn. So first of all, I think this is excellent. And it's cross-cutting across all of the pillars. And so I'm really appreciative of all the work that went into this. We talked as an advisory board, in one of our first meetings, just about the fact that this group has the opportunity to look across the pillars with sort of an objectivity, because we're not so far into each of those pillar areas. And so as we think about that, undoubtedly there may be trade-offs, particularly in some of those questions where what are the intended or unintended consequences and who will bear those. So there's things about and I guess I'm going to your second question rather than your first one, because I think with the first one, it's a little bit, the only thing I might say on that is, I hope every pillar is feeling like they've got some room to adapt the model as it may impact their different pillars. And so from an equity framework, it's process oriented, right, Kate? As you said, that's the piece of this that's the most critical. And so when we think about how that gets operationalized within the city after the recommendations are made, from my point of view as an advisory committee member, that's what I'm wondering about. So there's this process that you're all so carefully designing and co-creating. And then the question is, so then how does that translate into sustained operations within the city? So that's the thing that's most on my mind is, can this group serve as a helpful sounding board because of our hope, we all have perspectives, right? That's why we're here, but our objectivity about the definition. Sorry to have taken up so much space, but I hope that is helpful.
Yes, thank you for the comment, Deepa. And it makes me think, so similarly, the Health and Race Equity Impact Assessment Support Team is working for all of the pillars and also then has the job of looking across. And the way that we've been thinking that this might work is that we're lifting up specific policy recommendations and perhaps also calling out some process recommendations as well. And that may be getting to your point about how do we sustain some of these permanent structural changes across government over time. And I wonder if the advisory committee could be the place for us to lift up those cross-cutting sort of process things that we are seeing that are coming out of the assessments. Maybe that's something we could put in the bike rack and come back to, but that I think would be really valuable for us because that wouldn't necessarily be happening in the pillar teams specifically in the way that they're focused on their quality of life driver.
And Kate, if I may, I just wanted to add literally because I'm just hopped out of it. So the Office of Equity and Racial Justice at the same time is leading departments through a pretty intensive capacity building effort around building for equity and racial justice. And so to the question of, or to the part of the question that's about sort of what does this look like moving forward, we're at the same time actively building the capacity of leaders in our departments to be able to both understand equity deeply, but also utilize some of the same tools that we're talking about that would be used, particularly the HREIA, that would be used to move forward this work. So there's the job that we will do at this table. And one of the things I'm excited about is that we're all pretty coordinated and trying to work together to make sure that we're driving change in other places that build in right into the operations of how our city government really works. So that's literally got kicked off today. I just hopped out of that. It's a day-long session, and those department teams will be doing that work for 9 months, and we're going to run 2 cohorts. So when it's all said and done, it'll be about 20 departments that have gone through this intensive training.
See, Bridget has her hand raised.
Yes, good morning, everyone. This is Bridget Heyman speaking. Thank you, first off, for all of the time that you have put into this. I really like the approach, and it's incredibly thoughtful. To the second question on the slide here of how we can apply this to the work of the advisory committee, I think one of the things that I'm still finding to be somewhat a head scratcher is where the touch points are for the advisory committee and when it might be most useful to engage us. I work at Access Living. We are a disability advocacy and service organization. And one of the concerns that I have is that advisory committee engagement taking place after things are fully baked. And I know when it comes to race equity, for example, there is a disability overlay there with 11% of the Chicago population being people with disabilities, and the majority of those folks being Black and brown, quite honestly. And so, I do think we need to think strategically about where the touch points are with the advisory committee throughout the process, and perhaps a little earlier on, so that we're not going in and, maybe changing things or trying to operationalize without thinking about the strategy in advance. And so I'd love some clarity on that. And I would be very excited to be part of that process and having those touch points earlier with each of the pillars, because I do think that the strength of the advisory committee is to look at this more holistically, and really excited about that. But thank you for the work. And I did want to elevate that.
Yeah, Bridget, thank you so much for those points. That is hitting the nail on the head in terms of the things that we've been thinking about as we're designing the future meetings here. One thing we will note, and we were going to emphasize this at the tail end, is we hear you on the need to ensure that this group of the advisory committee is engaged all throughout the way, and at a point in which it can inform the work, in a way in which it can inform the work. And thus, we're excited right now. The group's just started to talk at a very high level about some of the objectives related to their pillars. We'll provide you all as an advisory committee once we have a bit more consensus in those pillars around sort of directionally where they're interested in exploring. We're going to provide you at the next advisory committee meeting in November an opportunity, like we did with the guiding questions, to really interrogate those, stretch the team, prompt them to think more deeply. And we're doing that at the same time that we're starting this public engagement on the We Will website, where folks can actually answer the guiding questions that will help the team also then use the advisory committee's feedback and the public feedback to be able to make sure that those objectives are as strong as possible, and that they're uplifting a lot of the intersectional ideas that you had noted that we want to make sure that at this point in the plan, we're not neglecting. I do want to lift up that we do have a lot of advocates or individuals that identify as people with disabilities that are members of pillar research teams. And so we hope that they're bringing some of that lens and commitment into the work. But also just want to voice that as a facilitation team, we know the vital importance of addressing the barriers, particularly facing the disability community. And your point is super well taken, and something that, as we are facilitating the process with the support of Muse and at the SB Friedman team, that we'll be looking for throughout, but we also know that is why you're here. And so we're excited for the next meeting in November to have another touch point to say, okay, how is the work evolving? And then really using your feedback to evolve it even further and providing that input to the team directly.
Okay, that sounds wonderful. This is Bridget speaking again. Thank you very much for that clarification. So is it reasonable to assume then that essentially what will happen is it's like every other month, the advisory committee will have an opportunity to kind of weigh in, and essentially the pillar groups then will come to expect that. And then the in-between meetings are where we see some of those results, right, of what the pillar teams have then gone back to work on. Is that how it's kind of structured throughout the process?
Yeah, I might ask either Courtney or Ranadeep to clarify the cadence of those specific report outs, because I don't think it's every other month,
okay.
But I can clarify.
Right. Okay. If you recall the slides about we had conceived the overall process in steps.
Yes.
And so the pillar co-chairs, and for each pillar, there's a city co-chair and a community co-chair.
Okay.
They come and report out at the end of each step. So in this case, it happened to be every other month. It won't necessarily be that way.
Got it. Okay.
And so for both the guiding questions and objectives, they reported out on a draft that was not yet finalized. So I hope that does offer, you know, some, I don't know, clarity on the points you raised, which I agree were excellent. And then there are things that are sort of too big, that are bigger than pillars, that we need the advisory committee. So things like historical reckoning, trust building, culture change, accountability, just to name a few. So we are trying to weave in that relationship between the work of the pillars that is much more deep, but also allowing time for the advisory committee to look at those very broad issues.
Yeah, that sounds great. Thank you for clarifying those points. And I think once you have a sense of how long steps are going to take, I know that's not an exact kind of process, but it would be good to understand as an advisory team member, because I'm sure many of us are going back to our communities, right, for additional feedback. So it's not just feedback that we're giving as individuals, but it's good to understand how much time we have to kind of gather that feedback from our communities to then share that with, you know, the pillar chairs. So if we have a sense of that a little bit more, it's really, really helpful.
And Bridget, this is Ranadeep. There's a slide later in this presentation which gives you the number of meetings and how that makes up a specific step.
Okay.
And what we are actually in the process of doing right now is figuring out the feedback loop between the advisory committee and the pillar work. And I think that's the key point. We are in the process, for example, the guiding questions, the synthesis of all the guiding questions come to the advisory committee group. So, you know, like in the prior meeting, it was presented by each co-chair, and we are getting this overall feedback. And what we have right now is we are trying to create a process by which your advice at the advisory committee level comes back to each pillar group. So it gets disaggregated again to each pillar group so that they can take that information and make adjustments and fine tune. And we are expecting, and each step that Courtney mentioned is a specific work product that comes out of it. For example, guiding questions come out of step 1, objectives will come out of step 2, right. Policy recommendations come out of step 3. So the way we've sort of designed this is that we are not at the final point where we are, you know, like say 3/4 of the way through one of those steps. And let's say it's objectives. We present the objectives to you. We get your feedback. It comes back to the pillar teams, and they're able to fine tune, adjust, and move forward. So that's one component of how we are thinking this feedback loop comes in. The second component, which also Courtney mentioned, is the concept of cross-cutting themes, which may be high up that it's probably better for the advisory committee. What we are sensing as the advisory committee's role is to take cross-cutting themes which run through every pillar, and things like trust building. And maybe that is advanced in the advisory committee itself to see what that means, and we can then take that information through the advisory committee meetings in between, where we have the pillar report outs, that you can take that idea and advance it further. So we are obviously covering historical reckoning in this meeting, but in other meetings we might have just advanced things like how do we get the trust building component built in, and we will have, as an end product, there are pillar reports, but there's also a cross-cutting report. And the cross-cutting report should have those themes that you are advancing incorporated in there as well.
All right. Thank you so much, everyone, for your questions and your comments and questions that are in the chat. They have all been noted and are very, very appreciated. So just for the sake of time, we do want to make sure we have ample small group opportunity for this next big theme discussion and conversation. So first off, just wanted to thank you, Kate, for all of that grounding in the health and racial equity impact assessment tool. We're really excited to use We Will Chicago as a process to help refine that framework and really concretize this best practice within city government for how future policies and programs should be created and evaluated. And I know just seeing some of your comments in the chat, advisory committee members. That's one of the guiding principles for why we're excited about using this tool together. So I'm so grateful for everything that we'll learn in trying it out. And so by asking questions about benefits, burdens, and historical events, the HREIA tool really connects strongly to the next big topic that we're going to discuss together, which is historical reckoning. So we'll be using many of our advisory committee meetings together to dive into the big themes of We Will Chicago. We're really grateful for the wisdom and experience that many of you are bringing into this work. And we're excited to be partners in designing a process and outcome that will align with these themes. So that's really the spirit of our conversation today. So as you know by now, one of the big themes of We Will Chicago is historical reckoning and trust building. Already across all of our pillar teams, building and repairing trust between communities and the city has been a consistent cross-pillar idea. It's almost emerged in every single pillar as something that we need to develop some thinking and conversations around to shape the final We Will Chicago plan. We'll have conversations with this group specific to trust building. We see this as a specific set of objectives and recommendations, like Ranadeep noted, that you as an advisory committee can really help us shape for the plan document overall at the end of this phase, because we know that it's not a challenge that's unique just to one pillar. It truly is cross-cutting. So today we want to focus more specifically on the big idea of historical reckoning within We Will Chicago. So we can go to the next slide. So historical reckoning, what does that mean? There's no easy textbook definition for historical reckoning. In fact, we want to use some of our time together today in small group breakouts with you to understand what this phrase means to you. Our current thinking about this theme is very much inspired by the ongoing work of the city's Office of Equity and Racial Justice with the leadership of Candace Moore, who's on the call today. The specific text on this slide is connected to the framework that OERJ, that office, is building for their year of healing in 2022. So historical reckoning is a process of acknowledging the wrongs of our past and our present, of truth-telling and story sharing to inform our shared understanding of our city. Reckoning also lifts up ideas of appraising or determining the impact of the past on the present and taking steps to repair that harm. So while the name really focuses on the past, historical, if you will, we see historical reckoning as an active process of learning from the past to then shape our collective future, to identify systems and outcomes we seek to change in the present in order to build a more equitable city. So we think about it in these three ways. Reflect on our past means educate and engage about the past and present historical injustices and structures of racial inequality. This draft framework was designed specifically around racial injustices and racial healing, but we know that there's a history of structural and interpersonal discrimination around intersecting identities, such as people with disabilities, trans-identifying Chicagoans, residents with criminal records, and so much more. The next is reclaiming our present. So how might we identify lessons learned of the past to inform new values and norms? So what values do we actually want to lift up to shape a different reality? What do we want to interrupt? The last bucket of this framework is reimagining our future. So vision a more inclusive future state and design policies to produce and sustain more equitable outcomes. So with this, we might ask questions like, what specific policies need to be removed or created? What structures of accountability need to be in place to sustain change? And how can we measure a more equitable and sustainable city in concrete ways for that accountability? And the power of the citywide plan really lies here, given its future orientation. I'll pause for just a minute to see if Candace Moore, if you have anything to add on some of that grounding before I transition to think about some of the ways in which we're thinking about applying this framework within We Will.
Thanks, Skylar. And I think you did a great job of covering, I think, really sort of big work that we've been trying to tackle at the Office of Equity and Racial Justice. I mean, I just want to, reiterate a couple points that you made about this really being a process. The way we've been sort of dissecting and engaging with communities on like, what does healing look like? What does healing in community to policy to action really look like, has led us down this path. So many different forms of feedback, of sitting with folks, wrestling through different ideas and different engagement is what has built out this framework. And part of what the Year of Healing is going to do is to continue to kind of test and assess what types of specific tools, strategies, examples we can pull out and in alignment with this framework to provide us with something that can support us moving forward. The other point I wanted to make is that as we think about historical reckoning, we will have to wrestle with the fact that there is no sort of 5-step process that we say, if you just go down this, you will get to historical reckoning. In many ways, we are building tools that have not been developed yet. We are trying to get to a future state that we have not yet seen. And so I jokingly say, for some of my type A folks, this is going to be real different. We are going down a path where we don't exactly know where we're going to end up. We don't exactly even know all the tools that we will need to be successful, but that is part of the journey. If we say we want transformative outcomes, we've got to engage in transformative processes. And that's necessarily something new. So I'm excited to learn where the discussion takes us. We're kind of putting this question back to you. Use this as a grounding, as a foundation to inspire your thinking, but this is work we've necessarily got to do together. So I'm appreciative of the discussion that I think you guys will get in. I won't be able to stay on much longer. I have to go back to that cohort I mentioned, but I'm eager to hear your thoughts and know that we're sort of very much building this as we go along together to try to get to that place where we believe that we are putting in the right steps to get us to this sort of transformative impact that we want to see throughout this process.
Thank you for that, Candace. So we'll transition to the next slide. And there are many ways in which the We Will team of city staff and consultants is currently thinking about historical reckoning through this process. So this is not meant to be an exhaustive list or a check the box. We know this work is iterative and evolving, and we're really excited to build it with your continued feedback and ideas starting today and beyond. So when we think about the first principle of reflecting on our past, some of the ways in which we've approached this so far or are thinking of approaching it are reflected in the bullets underneath. So you know that in meeting 1 that included many of you, the advisory committee and the pillar teams together, we grounded our first conversation together on the history of planning and its impacts. Within each of the pillar teams thereafter, some of the early discussion and icebreaker questions were more about his personal histories and reflections on the histories of the pillars that we knew was really foundational to ensuring that we had space for the team members to articulate some of the problems inherent within the pillars in which they represent. We have been inventorying past citywide and neighborhood plans as part of this process. And that's been both a tool that's available for the research team to be able to have this treasure trove of knowledge of past planning that has been tried in the city and has been implemented in the city. We're also going to make that into a public inventory so that when we put out the citywide plan, we're seeing it as built upon the shoulders of many of the other neighborhood scale efforts that have happened, as well as past efforts to collect community input on citywide plans and policies as well. The next piece is the review of baseline historical data, and that's just what Ranadeep provided to us today. You saw some of the shared slides that were presented across all the pillars, and we also dove a little bit more deeply in each pillar on specific historical data related to that specific topic. For example, there might have been some more maps and data shown related to environmental justice within the specific environmental pillar, as was one of the questions in the chat. One of the activities that the Office of Equity and Racial Justice is building is a racial history of Chicago video series that I know I'm personally super amped to see very soon. So this is a collaboration with the local historian Dilla as part of the Year of Healing, where the video series will document the historical impact of Chicago's 5 prominent racial groups and what that impact has had on shaping the city, both in terms of the built environment and the policies. And those videos will be released at some point this winter. So we'll be excited to share them with you all once they're live. And lastly, one thing that we're thinking about for the future is the way in which we can take some of those context setting, grounding slides that Ranadeep had shared on sort of the data and some of the elements of the history of Chicago and incorporate it into the plan document itself, so that as readers, as Chicagoans are going through, it is a moment of recognition and a moment of shared learning for us to ground ourselves in some of that history of our city. The next slide shows how we're thinking about reclaiming our present and reimagining our future in some ways through this process. So we know that creating the guiding questions, the objectives, and the policy framework, those very processes are designed to address inequitable outcomes and create a more equitable city moving forward. The HREIA that Kate had mentioned today, that health and racial equity impact assessment, there are questions within there that speak to understanding the benefits and the burdens of proposed policies and challenging the teams to think through a plan in order to minimize any harm. The next piece is on community engagement. So we know that in order for this to truly be a process in which we are collectively reclaiming our present and reimagining our future, that we need to bring in new voices at the neighborhood level in order to shape this plan together. And many of the questions, even those that we see right now on the website on wewillchicago.com, speak to getting thoughts and ideas about what a more equitable and resilient Chicago looks like within each of the pillars of the citywide plan. And these last two are future oriented, so things that we're thinking about. One, I already mentioned, this idea of you all as advisory committee members really helping us build some trust building recommendations and overall sort of governance and implementation recommendations that will make for a strong, successful, sustainable plan that actually does change conditions on the ground for communities that we care about. And that speaks to the last bullet, which is designing a transparent and accountable implementation structure that will really make the plan a reality, which I know even from hearing comments today, we're eager to jump into that kind of conversation. And we know that we will be bucketing future discussion times on that very piece within the advisory committee. So today, I know that was a lot of content and just food for thought for you to think about how we're approaching historical reckoning in a directional way. And so today we're really going to use time in small group conversations to dive into some big questions around historical reckoning. The first of which is a little bit more personal to help us illuminate our collective understanding of this theme. So that question in your small groups will be, what does historical reckoning mean to you? So for this, your thoughts are really going to help us shape a working definition to guide our work and hold us accountable. Also within this, if it's a lofty sort of term, so if it's more accessible to you, feel free to offer up some examples of work you have seen that speaks to this idea. Maybe a really powerful project or experience that you feel like encapsulates your thinking on historical reckoning. And next, the last question for our small groups is, with this framework in mind of reflecting on our past, reclaiming our present, and reimagining our future, how might we strengthen our approach to historical reckoning within the We Will Chicago process? So what are some tangible steps that we can take that would help strengthen this alignment? Each of our small groups is going to have a note taker and a facilitator to dive into these two questions in blue, and we'll come back together for your reactions to these questions to learn from one another during a quick report out. So Courtney, how much time do we now have for small groups? Oh, you're muted. You're muted, Courtney.
Things were going too smoothly, right? I think we should stick with 30 minutes and we might have to condense the Q&A at the end, but we could record that via chat. Was glad to have the discussion around HREIA and process, and want to leave plenty of time in these small groups. So we will be putting folks into small groups. We'll do it kind of slowly as far as an upstart. If you need a quick break, now's the time to step away and do that. So we will see you all back here at, we'll call it 10:35.
I'm sorry, we're taking a half an hour break?
Yeah, I think a little shorter, right? No, I'm sorry. We are going to be put into breakouts, and the breakouts will have 30 minutes to do their work. But as we're going to breakouts, feel free to step away and take a 3-minute break as we transition. Sorry about that. So we don't yet have everyone back, huh? They must be.
Oh, here they come. I hit my button too fast.
Ah, there we go. There we go. So I know in group one, we really took Candace's comments to heart about that, you know, there isn't just a checklist we can follow, and it is up to us to figure this out. Maureen offered to report out from group one. We promised we would help, but Maureen, if you could share a little bit about the conversation we had there, and then we'll move on to groups 2 and 3.
Sure. So in our group, we kind of acknowledged that historical reckoning is the multi-step process. You know, there's sort of acknowledgement of past wrongs, and then being really creative and intentional in creating sort of radical policy changes. And of course, you know, implementing that successfully, having the funding and the money to implement that. We also talked about the need to kind of have authenticity, and that it's important not just for the We Will Chicago team to endorse this, but we need to hear it from elected officials. We need to hear them sort of acknowledge what's happened historically and currently, and the harms that have been done. So kind of naming these issues, and then really working hard both in the public and private sector to create solutions. So we talked a lot about, you know, changing what we have the power to change, but also acknowledging that there might be things that are not city function, things that are more, you know, controlled by the federal government, but how can we think uniquely, kind of do everything we can. And then we also talked about, you know, if we accountability, you know, this is coming from the mayor's office, but should there be like another board that is overseeing, you know, the implementation, or how do we kind of make sure that communities that may not trust city government because of this history have faith in this plan? So I'd say that's kind of overall our discussion.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Anyone want to add anything from group one? Otherwise, we'll see, we'll hear from group 2.
And Mary from our group said she would be happy to share some insights, but we will jump in, Mary, as well. If you'd like some support.
I think our group echoed a lot of what we kind of just heard in terms, especially just building on the last comment around community building and trust building within the community, and kind of hearing from the community and empowering those communities that kind of have been left behind, and how to build them into the process. And also we talked a lot about collective action and actually reaching solutions. So while acknowledging our past and taking account of what's happened, really taking account of where we are right now and what we can do to kind of move forward in terms of embracing solutions. So I don't know if you guys have anything you want to add. We had a lot of the same sentiments, I think, that were echoed from the first speaker as well.
Thank you. A representative from group 3.
So we were talking about at the beginning how, you know, it's a bit difficult to translate the word reckoning to Spanish, or even to a Latino culture, not only like the specific translation, but the concept. So we were talking about what it means, right? Like, is it a calculation or an account of what the harm has meant? And then we were talking about how the word reckoning kind of resembles accountability, or is it a, you know, kind of a synonym of that concept, right? So we were talking about, is there a possibility for us to come up with something that would actually like be understood and embraced by a Spanish speaking audience. But we were also talking about, how historical we are thinking, right? Like, are we talking about 1930s as a crucial decade to recognize? Are we going back farther than that? And we were talking about also recognizing and acknowledging, slavery, the fact that we are in the Potawatomi land, and pose these questions and narratives about honoring the disability history, right, and the harmful policy that have affected the population, right? So we also, in terms of the second question, how do we strengthen our approach to historical reckoning through this process? We were talking about that the point of the plan is to change the future, and even though we do need to look at the past, we understand that there's a little bit of tension there, right? Like, how much time or how deep or difficult would it be to analyze the past in order to create something different for the future. And then in that creation of something different, we started talking about the need for metrics for both the individuals and their life experience, as well as community-wide indicators and metrics, right? For what do we mean when we talk about, farther, acknowledging and trying to, get to a point of more equity in our city. And we also talked about keeping it simple, right? Pick the things that are very, very critical for everybody, and where do we want to go as the residents of this city, and keeping it consistent so that we can create not only the policy recommendations, but the implementations plans that will make a difference for everybody.
Thank you so much. Any other general questions or comments, having heard the report out from the 3 groups?
I want to say something. We got a little cut off just because it's such a rich discussion, and it takes, at least for me, I'm going to say it's taken a little time to warm up, even though we've been on the phone for, an hour and 45. But someone from our group talked about the fact that, for some residents of the city, there's a lot of trauma where folks aren't necessarily like in a place where they're ready to engage. And so there's a big assumption here about who we're engaging with, how and why. And so I want to maybe just, I feel very strongly about us centering on, we all keep saying the word centering on community, or wanting to make sure there's community voice. And I think there's a real recognition that people are in different places across the city. And that is in part the challenge. I'm talking behaviorally, emotionally, as well as in terms of their ability and time to engage in something like this. And so there's a potential way for us, as we're all coming together, to address that head on. And as if we're supposed to be a microcosm of the city, how do we make sure that we're designing this in such a way that we're meeting folks where they are and how they need to be engaged, how they may want to be engaged or not, in order to be able to include them in that process without sort of judgment about how well or low they did based on whatever heuristics we have in mind. So I'm saying this both out of firsthand experience right now and work that I'm doing, but I'm also saying it in terms of even our room here, we're a cross section, and it's just hard to get full representation. We all know that. That's just the challenge of public service and social work in general. But I just want us to be really mindful of it, because with as many of us on the phone with our different networks, and then all of the pillar groups, we have a real opportunity here to mobilize in a different way. And parity doesn't necessarily mean we're going to achieve equity. So I don't know if one process, it makes it simple for us to organize it, but it may not make it simple for us in terms of what we receive back in the end.
And I have to, you know, echo that for sure, Deepa. One of the things that I am guilty of, I've been talking about, you know, we need to engage the monolingual Spanish-speaking community. We need to engage them. And I've seen in that multiple community meetings, we haven't had a group, a community event or anything for that population particularly. And again, I'm guilty of it because I need to coordinate and have my community better represented, right? And I know we have an issue with access, et cetera, and that technology, like even though you may post it in social media, et cetera, it's not going to be the same level of participation. So I know that's part of me, right? I need to make a better effort to have, you know, that particular population more engaged.
Yeah, thank you so much, Katya and Deepa, for that. I mean, you know, in full transparency and honesty, I think we're experiencing the same challenges that Deepa, you lifted up around community engagement in this virtual moment. Like even within the artist and organizer framework, they found in a lot of their meetings, they had to do so much context setting about what planning is, that often for a lot of people, it just feels divorced from their everyday experience and the traumas that they're facing and the concerns they have for their family. And so in any moment, I feel like planning, it's hard to engage people in a deep way around planning, and even more so in this current moment in which we are living. I think that our opportunities with the community partners coming up are a good way for us to model what it looks like for trusted voices to format their own kinds of conversation in ways that are a bit more accessible for their communities. And how do we learn from some of the victories and the shortfalls that might come in the coming months when community partners are hosting some of those meetings, to then think about what a broader public engagement strategy looks like in 2022, as we start to bring some of the draft plans into fruition in communities to talk about, okay, here's what we put down pen to paper. What do you think needs to be changed? What do we need to strengthen before it's adopted as the final citywide plan in 2023? So just noting that I think we often feel like we're not getting, like we I think can take accounting of some of the ways in which that engagement has been a challenge and focus our energy next on then what might that mean for the coming months and what we can do differently. So just honoring that, you know, that tension, and I would love to hear thoughts from this group continue like beyond this moment of how we might continue to work through that, and what we might need to do, even if it's like, hey, this thing on the website doesn't make sense when I read it, like, well, how do we need to change it in order to be more relevant for our communities? That's just a concrete example of how we hope to tap you all for some of those ideas too. And I know that you all are really interested, and some of you had noted an interest in the meeting in a box to actually get your hands dirty and some of the like, let's actually bring this into a public setting. Maybe I even like host a meeting with 4 or 5 people that I know and try to bring these questions to them and see how it lands. Just want to invite you all to think about if that's a role that you're interested in helping us iterate on this piece of how do we have these conversations in spaces that aren't just this virtual room. I think that will be enormously helpful, and something I want you all to consider as one way that you can get involved in the months to come.
I have a question. Sorry, when you're talking about these sort of community engagement and like listening sessions and however we can engage communities, I was just wondering if you could let us know what does our language capacity look like? I'm assuming we can do these things in English and Spanish, but how about other languages?
Yeah, so for the community partner meetings in particular, those many of those organizations, they are bringing in translation for their meetings, or they're just hosting meetings in their primary language of the constituency in which they represent. So I think if you're hosting a meeting in a box and you want it to be translated for your community that might speak a specific language, just making sure that you have someone there that can lead it in that way. I think in terms of the broader strategy, as we think about what additional convenings would look like that the city might host in 2022 as well. I think normally we, like with the kickoff event, we had made that one available in Spanish, but if there are additional languages that are requested, the city of Chicago does have a process for Language-Line to make sure that we have other translation services available.
I wanted to share a note that planning in general, because it has often been so far removed from everyday people, is a hard concept to bring into communities. I also want to recognize that, so one, the concepts are sometimes not very natural, although they impact everyone's lives on a daily basis. There's also never a great time. There are always challenges and issues that all of our communities are always facing. So hopefully, I think one approach is to recognize that, right? That planning is not always something that we all learn about or understand. 2, it's never the perfect time. And 3, ideally, this is the beginning of many other sort of check-ins. This type of plan hasn't been done in a long time, which is probably why it feels so foreign. But if there is a commitment also from the city and just allied partners to be able to do this on a more regular basis, say, a check-in in a year and a half, 2 years or 6 months, and one in like 2 years or 5 years, I feel like this is the hardest part of this work right now because it hasn't been done. But I think helping people, all of us, understand that there is a commitment, ideally, to make sure that these continue to happen. I think over a period of 5 years, hopefully we will be able to engage better and sort of bring people to a place more comfortable participating, more comfortable in sharing. So I think there is also a layer of, self-understanding and sort of recognizing and knowing that it's the beginning of a journey, not hopefully just the end of this journey with this plan.
Thank you so much. And these last comments in particular are helpful for the last thing we want to talk to you about. I think there's people who at different times feel like we're not moving fast enough or might feel like we're moving too fast. We've had a lot of feedback, particularly from Pillar research team members, but in general that I think the broader consensus is this needs more time to task ourselves with historical reckoning, trust building, culture change, power shifting. It simply takes time that we did not initially account for in the process. So I'm going to pull up just 2 more slides. We want to preview for you our response to that and get your comments on this idea. So Kathy, could you walk us through this?
Sure. So as Courtney said, we have been hearing that, I think this gets to some other points too. We're hearing that, there's so much coming at people and we need more time. So for example, the conversation we had today, we need more time to really discuss it. So we are looking to extend the timeline. So initially, we were going to try to get to a framework by the end of March. We're looking now to get to a framework by the end of June of next year. And so you can see we're trying to move parts of the work to just have more time to do a lot of discussion about all these things, which I think people were saying that the conversation we just had was took an hour and 45 minutes to really sort of warm up to it. So that is our intent, is to kind of give us all more time to move into this so that we're not like feeling this rush. And I think just we need to do that. We need to work collectively as a group, and we need to identify different roles for people, all the things that came up in the discussions today. Not that we may achieve everything, because I think what we all heard is this is, we're not quite, this is a path we haven't been on. It's a journey. It's going to take us a lot of time to set this up, to make this big change that we're talking about. So that is the first thing that we all want to do. You want to go to the next slide? So again, I guess I talked about some of the benefits of this extended structure. We do need to execute more community engagement. And I think I just saw a question chat, like, how did the artist organizer work go, meeting people where they are at? I think it's good to know that we need to meet people where we are, but we're even having a difficult time sometimes of getting people together to be able to even discuss this, because they're much more concerned about maybe something that's really immediate than this bigger thing that I think Rosa was saying. Planning is not something that most people are used to, and planning is not something most people are used to at the level that we're doing it. So we need to execute and really want to look at what ideas you have. I think, Isabel, your idea earlier, what you said you were exploring, which is a process for intergenerational conversations about justice. We'll want to follow. Ideas like that is really what we're looking at, and how we can move those into next year. For this group, and I think this was said earlier, that this is a place where we need to have those cross-pillar topics, which are kind of the one we had today, accountability, the way that all these things are going to connect. We're even having deep discussions in the pillar groups, and then when we have to bring them all together, that's going to be even a deeper kind of discussion. And then again, more time for the reflection that we just had. I think we just heard a lot of real understanding from everyone as to what we're trying to do here. And that's going to take a lot of conversation and a lot of really work on how we're going to get to action, how we're going to make these things work once we figure out the policy. It's one thing to come up with a policy, it's another thing is how is that going to actually be enacted? How are we going to move these things forward? So this is where we're at right now. Just discussing and giving ourselves more time into June. And then also we're all in the process of how do we expand? How do we broaden and deepen engagement in next year based on what we've learned? And from just to discuss what we're doing this year, and we will continue to explore with the meeting in the box this year. So we do have that. Christine's been working on that with people in the planning department. And I think we're looking at that as exploring that as an opportunity this year, seeing how it works and learning from that to improve it next year. So I don't think we'll have much time for discussion, but all ideas in the chat, we certainly would welcome those. And this is what we're looking at, trying to develop for next year as we continue this conversation and build these ideas.
Right, so we did share a brief questionnaire about this idea, seeing what questions or concerns people might have. So please respond to that so we can understand if people are ready, willing, and able to continue their commitment. I think the benefits are well established. It's just a matter of affirming that everyone's in for a few extra months of this process. So to wrap up, we will see you again in November, where we will have report outs from pillar co-chairs about their progress on the objectives. We will certainly be synthesizing the information we got here, not only around historical reckoning, but process, community engagement, accountability. So we will see you back in November and hope to dig in more to some of those cross-cutting themes and what we're calling cross-pillar ideas to make sure the feedback loops are happening and we're advancing each aspect of this work. I just want to thank everyone for your participation, openness, and vulnerability today. There's a lot for us to sink our teeth into and bring back in terms of some synthesized ideas.
And Courtney, before we just sign off, do you just want to give a quick, we've had the same conversation in all the pillar groups about the extension. I don't know if you just want to say anything about how people are thinking there.
Oh, sure. So yes, during Pillar Week last week, the meeting extension was discussed, and then I can share that preliminary results from the survey. I think of the 70 people who had responded at the end of last week, there were only 3 who shared a concern about the idea. So overwhelming support. I think people are committed, they understand the benefits, and we hope that that remains with the rest of the people responding.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Appreciate the time. Enjoy the rest of your day. Talk soon.
Well done, guys. Thanks.
Hi, Mary. Thank you.